are you going to join us? Okay. So we are starting our last panel of today and of the conference. And I hope that you had a good lunch, because now we have 2 hours of interesting work. We will have 3 presentations that will be about second generation migrants, migrant children in Europe and in Russia. And we will have first presentation by Maurice Krul and Franz Lely. Then we will have Ksenia Tenisheva, who will speak about migrant children in St. Petersburg. Then we will have Evgeny Varshaver, who will speak about grown-up children of migrants in Russia. And finally, we will have Jens Schneider, who will be our discussant and who will try to wrap it up. Afterwards, we will have floor for discussion and for concluding remarks. So we will have 20 to 25 minutes for each presentation, and I hope you will be in time. I will show you some cards if you are not. And so, Maurice and Franz, please.
Yep. Okay, we'll take the wireless. Okay, once again, welcome back from lunch. I'm going to talk about the second generation in Europe, and particularly about education. But I will mostly talk about school systems. And at the end of my talk, I will try to connect that to some of the research findings that I've seen, especially the study of Anna Evgeny about the second generation here in Russia, to see where some of the concepts we developed could maybe be also interesting for the analysis of the Russian context. So that's more for the debate maybe. So I will present findings from 2 big studies. The TICE study that is comparing the second generation in 9 European countries and Australia. And the main groups that we looked at were Turkish, Moroccan, and former Yugoslavian second generation. And in Australia, Lebanese and Turkish second generation. And in Estonia, we looked at the Russian second generation. I will not be talking about the Russian second generation in Estonia, but maybe it will come up again in the discussion. And then we did a further project, the ELITES project, in-depth interviews with successful second generation professionals in a number of countries across Europe. Now, just want to say a few words about my field, migration and ethnic studies, and the theories that were developed there. Assimilation and integration theories that will be discussed, I think, also in the rest of the sessions more precisely. And they put a big emphasis on background characteristics of migrants' families. That's usually how outcomes in school and labor market are explained. In our research, it's the national institutional arrangements that we try to focus on. More precisely, how do different educational systems deal with the children of migrants in different countries? And what are the factors in these educational systems that either make them successful or fail? So we switch the focus through the ethnic lens, through the migrant group, to the structure and power relations in society itself. That's the main shift that we try to make in our project. Because I think there's quite a blind spot, and I also saw that again in this conference. We're talking a lot about the migrants, the refugees, but not about the receiving society and the institutions that enable or hinder people to become part of that society. And it's also in the methodology of many studies. We study mostly ethnic groups in a one city or one country context, and then we compare the groups across each other, mostly with the norm group, the nationals, or the majority group, and then we see differences between these groups, and then we explain them by looking at the characteristics of these groups, these background characteristic groups, and then we think that we know why they are underperforming. And the institutional context, the school system, the structure of the labor market that explains these differences is often forgotten or is taken as a sort of given. The national context is taken as a given. So what is the importance of national institutional arrangement? That's basically the storyline. Now let's look at some of the findings from the TIE study. We have had that one of the comparison groups across countries is the group of Turkish descent. So children of Turkish labor migrants that came in the 60s, 70s or 80s to Europe. And they make it for an extremely interesting comparison group. And we did the surveying among them, and we did even make a subsample of only children that are from parents that are low educated, that came as labor migrants. So we excluded, for instance, families that were refugees that came to Europe or professionals. So in fact, we had a perfect natural experiment. These children came all from Turkey, mostly from rural areas, where there was little education for the parents at that point of time. And we only looked at the children that were born in Europe but lived in different countries. And now you see how different the outcomes are across these countries. So in Sweden, 30% of them received a higher education diploma, even when their parents were often only went to school in Turkey at the primary school level. Many of the women were even not attending school, and some of them were illiterate, but 30% of them entered into higher education and received a diploma there. In Germany, this was only the case for 5%. So 6 times as many in Sweden compared to Germany. So if you look at the literature across Europe on the Turkish community, there's a vast amount of literature explaining, yes, especially in places like Germany and Austria, the poor results of schooling are the results of family characteristics. They are not interested in education in the same way as the nationals, but here you see that somehow other factors need to be in there to explain these differences, because they're all the same. They all came from Turkey, they're all born in Europe, they all came from low educated parents. So how to explain these differences? And we found out, because we asked them about the whole school career, what were the institutional arrangements that explain these differences. And we more or less came to 4 important differences between these systems. And I can best explain it with the 2 extreme examples, Germany and Sweden. In Germany, we asked the children, many of them didn't go to preschool, and they only entered school at the beginning of elementary school. At that point of time, they were fluent in Turkish, but they hardly spoke any German. Then in Germany, there's a half-day school system, so only in the morning, which makes the school system very much dependent on the help and support of the parents. And of course, these parents, especially because of language and the lack of education they had, were unable to give that. And then in Germany, you are selected at the age of 10. So you start school at the age of 4, and already at the age of 10, you're selected out either going to vocational education or academic education. And as a result, of course, you see that most of them went into the vocational track. Now let's look at the Swedish example. There, most of the children went to preschool from a very early age onwards. And it's free of charge, and most of the families make use of this system. When they entered Swedish school, they already were speaking Swedish. It's a full-day school system, so you work on your homework at school under the guidance of teachers and not of your parents. And we also found out in the analysis that there is no effect on whether your parents help you with homework or not on your school results. Well, in Germany there was a huge effect of this factor. And then selection only takes place at the age of 15. So they have a much longer period to close the gaps that they still have. And many of them are progressing into the academic track, gymnasium, and onwards to university. So these are the real system factors that make a difference and explain the difference between these countries. The Netherlands is in an interesting case too, because we have an early selection and a late start, so pretty much the same as Germany, but in the Netherlands you can still move from vocational education into an academic track. It's called the long route. It takes you 3 years extra, but half of the Turkish second generation in the Netherlands that is in higher education took this longer route to university. And we found that also in other countries, and it's also the college route in the US, community college, as a stepping stone to research. So if this possibility is available, migrant children and family will take opportunity of this possibility. And in the Netherlands, twice as many children of immigrants take this longer route compared to the children of Dutch descent. Now, it doesn't mean if you're successful in school that it also pays out in the labor market. And here you see, so for instance, 20% received a higher education diploma in France, but only 10% is working on that level in a managerial function. So it's a leaking system, which is partly the result of unemployment and partly that they are devalued on the labor market, not valued in the same way as people of French descent. And especially in France, the transition to the labor movement seems to be very, very much problematic. And in the Netherlands, it's less so, and it's partly because there's a lot of apprenticeship places also in higher education that smooth the transition to the labor market. So employers are already known with these people because they did an internship there, and then they hire these people because they know the qualities of the people and don't look so much anymore at their background characteristics or their names or their religion. Now, an interesting thing here is, with this slide, that you see that some of the people in Germany still access managerial positions while not having a higher education diploma. And this had to do with the system in Germany with schooling while working. So there's a lot of people that go into the labor market and then by step by step climbing in position in the labor market. Sometimes there's also extra training. But there is a caveat to this. They only reach lower managerial positions, because for the higher managerial positions you need a higher education diploma, and they don't have that. So again, you see this apprenticeship system, the internships, again, institutional arrangement, they are lacking in some countries and are there in other countries. Then we also did a qualitative part in our research, the ELITES project, interviewing 189 professionals. And we were again especially interested, more than, of course, the quantitative results of how things worked out for them in these pathways. And what we saw in Germany, that partly reflected what we found already in the quantitative results. In Germany, there was a lot of talk about the difficulties in the educational system. Some of them were very clever, but were not allowed to go to gymnasium. And those who were in gymnasium were often the only immigrant there because it's such a selective system. And they've experienced a lot of discrimination and ethnic stereotyping. Also those who went to university, they were often the first Turkish German person in the university in a department, and they experienced a lot of ethnic stereotyping as a result. In France and Sweden, education is hardly part of the interviews. It's hardly part of the interviews. It's a smooth, quite smooth transition, but the real stuff comes when entering the labor market and what happened there, either not being accepted in the labor market, discrimination experiences, and that covered a lot of the interviews there. Now, we also developed a sort of new concept to explain the steep mobility that some of these children experienced. We talk about children from very low educated parents, migrant parents that are now working as professionals. How to explain this? We have a lot of theories from Boudon to Bourdieu about reproduction of class positions, but how to explain actually this steep mobility that some of them experience. And what we saw actually, that successful second generation professionals accumulate social cultural capital along the way. Each step in their career, they accumulate more cultural and social capital that is of use for the next step. And we call this the multiplier effect because it sort of expands over time. To put that more in perspective, you see that a lot of the parents of these successful children put a lot of pressure and gave emotional support to do well in school, but often they didn't have the practical means to do that. But as a result, some of them moved to the academic track. And here, of course, it's very important across countries if educational systems provide that opportunity so that you can grab that opportunity. But then they enter in an academic track where there's usually more children from middle class and higher class families. And in that environment, they adjust, of course, influenced by peers and their families, and they accumulate also cultural and social capital that is helpful further on in their career. And in higher education, we saw that a lot of, for instance, they start to study law in the university, and then they are among students whose fathers or mothers are also doing this as a profession. So they get into a community that has contacts in the law firms, and again, they acquire more social and cultural capital to be successfully entering into the field. And then on the labor market, they again need to adjust to the corporate culture. And you will see that they're very, from the stories we hear, they're very keen on getting into this corporate culture. But it's also interesting, they say to us, we learned this from a very young child onwards. We know how it is for an immigrant child to stand out in school, in primary school, in secondary school. We know to adapt to different situations. So we are capable of easily adapting. And actually, corporate law firms are easy. You look at the people around you, you see the sort of suits they wear, the shoes, and you copy it. And then you become part of it. So they are very keen on using their social and cultural skills. So, to round up, I don't know how much time I still have. Oh. So, how to use some of these concepts that we developed, the concepts around institutional arrangements in education and the labor market, but also the multiplier effect for some of the findings that I was able to see in the study that Evgeny and Anna sent me about the second generation Russians in in Russia. And I think if you think of a comparable group in terms of socioeconomic background characteristics, in your study the group from Central Asia is maybe coming most closest to the groups we studied in Europe in terms of the educational level of the parents. And so one of the questions I would have for you actually, what are the institutional arrangements here that hinder or help Central Asian second generation children in school? I saw in the outcomes that, for instance, quite a lot of them only finished 8th or 9th or 10th grade and didn't move into higher education. So what are the institutional arrangements in the Russian school system that provide this outcome? I didn't see very large differences across Russian regions. In income, yes, but in education, I think there are not so many. So, are there important differences in, for instance, preschool selection, segregation in schools, contact hours? We talked a bit before this discussion about the availability of second language teaching, especially from areas where in school, previously when the children were in school in the home country, Russian was not taught. So there's probably differences across region if that is available or not. And it probably will affect school results. We also see quite big differences within this Central Asian second generation group. But some are performing quite well and some are staying behind. So what is the multiplier effect there? Why are some able to succeed while maybe in their family they don't have the cultural, social capital and the practical help and support and still succeed to make it in school? So these would be interesting questions from the tools that we developed in our study to look at the study in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurice. Franz, thank you for presenting the results of your projects. That was very interesting. And I would suggest having maybe 1 or 2 questions for clarifications now. And after all the presentations, after Jens is discussing this, we will have more space for discussing. So, clarification.
Thanks, Maurice. Thank you for illuminating the presentation. Understanding question. You mentioned the choice that Turkish and other children with migration background have to make in Germany at the age of 10. What does it relate to, this choice? Am I right? Hauptschule, something like that?
No, indeed, there's 3 tracks, of course, Hauptschule, Realschule, and Gymnasium. And the first 2 are lower vocational education and middle vocational education at the secondary level. So, and then there's Gymnasium that prepares for university and Fachhochschule. But of course, it's not a choice. It's based on your school results. So, and that's the point I'm trying to make, that in a situation with half the school system and not any preparation in terms of second language education and preschool, that's an almost impossible thing to do. So, regardless of their intellectual capacity, most of them will go to the vocational tracks. And in Germany, it is possible theoretically to move up with an Abitur into the academic track, but we saw hardly any evidence of this permeability of the school system like we have in the Netherlands. So basically, at the age of 10, your future is decided.
Thanks a lot, Maurice. This opportunity structured model always shows very clearly. But also, addition to that, it's not only your grades, also this class teacher's recommendation, which is deadly. You could see that very clearly. My question is an information question in relation to Germany. Did you look at also in comparison to children with very uneducated parents, what is the percentage to the higher education? Because somehow I have the feeling that these were going out, again badly, but if you could give us, then we could see it more clearly, I think. Thanks a lot.
No, that's of course a very good question, because this educational system doesn't only work to the disadvantage of these immigrant families and their children, but also to the working class families that are of German descent. And we see this. So, and that, I mean, that's also always part of the discussion I have with policymakers. Then they say, yeah, but this is happening also to to the people of German descent. So, is there a real problem? There is also a real problem because it works extremely worse for the immigrant children, because language plays such a big role in this system and also for the selection. And it plays a role in the school advice of the teacher, for instance. And so we see actually two things that are true for all countries. That if a system works badly for the working class population, it works extra badly for the migrant population. But if there's possibilities in the school system, like this stepping stone permeability that we have, the long route in the Netherlands, we see also if there's opportunities, migrant families extra take these opportunities at hand to be successful, because there's a huge drive to be successful in school. So it works both in the negative and the positive sense. We do in the publications, we do, yeah. Because we sampled actually the group of German descent in the same neighborhoods as where the migrant children were sampled.
Thank you very much, and we will keep your questions for discussion afterwards. And now,
and the publication is to download for free at the Elite's website. You can download all the publications in open access.
yeah, thank you. So now the floor is yours, Ksenia.
Thank you, Anya, and thank you, Maurice, for the presentation. I think that my presentation will give some answers to the questions that you posted, and maybe this will give rise to the new questions. We'll see. Actually, I will present the result of a really huge, to the moment, long-term project that mainly takes place in St. Petersburg, and we also have data on Greater Moscow, which is Moscow region, and some other regions and areas in Russia. So at the moment we have more than 20,000 students served in these schools, and we have some additional very detailed data on Kaluga region, which is not far from Moscow. And this all allows us to assess the situation of migrant children in Russian schools. So mainly, we use some literature from the USA on underachievement and the reasons for the underachievement of migrant children in Russian schools. And of course, we also use a lot of theoretical background from European studies, including the studies by Maurice and by Jens. So I'm very happy to be here with you. And what is quite surprising about Russian case is that our data shows that in general, on average, migrants in Russian schools do not experience problems. If you control for socioeconomic status, migrants do not underachieve in Russian schools. For Russia, Russia is a little bit a special case for migration studies, because of course you all know that we used to be a part of Soviet Union, so we used to be the same country with a lot of countries which are separate territories nowadays. So it's a good question, what should be considered to be international migration in terms of migration to Russia? If parents came when it used to be Soviet Union and now these children are children of Uzbek parents, are they international migrants? Are they internal migrants? We don't know. And we suppose we have more problems here. Like we have people who come from Belarus or Belarus and Ukraine, and these are independent countries, but they speak Russian, they study in Russian at their schools, they experience no problem when coming to Russian schools. But at the same time, we have Chechnya, we have Dagestan and other republics of Russian Federation, and they usually speak in their own languages and they educate in their own languages in their home regions, and then they come to Moscow or St. Petersburg, and they can experience huge problems while being officially internal migrants. So it is very important to disentangle ethnicity and migration for the migration studies in Russia. First of all, we operationalize ethnic minorities as students whose parents speak a different language, non-Russian language. And migrants are simply people who experienced some displacement, who moved from one place to another. We even consider persons who came from Leningrad, St. Petersburg region to St. Petersburg migrants. And again, we introduce widely known concept of visible minorities. So in our studies, we use the word ethnic minority only for those who are visually different from us, because we suppose that these students experience most problems at schools, these grown-ups experience most problems when looking for the jobs, and so on. So students from Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova are not included in the group of ethnic minorities in our studies. So here is a brief statistics of what we know about Russian schools according to our own research. We mainly surveyed the students of 9th grades, so we actually don't know much about those studying in the 10th and 11th grades, which are high school students. And we also don't know much about the primary school, which might be very interesting because we know that there are many small migrant children coming to our schools. We don't know anything about them. So according to the statistics, about 14, 15 years old migrants in our schools, you can see that we don't have a lot of them. It's not the case of Germany, for example, where they have special schools with 90-something% of Turkish children. We almost don't have schools with that many migrants. Usually we have about 10 to 15% of migrants, which means 2 or 3 kids per class. So first I will tell you a little bit about these visible minorities who are visibly different from us in Russian schools. And again, you can see that we only have very few schools in St. Petersburg which have more than 50% of these visible minorities. And these are schools which are known among the people as Georgian school and as Armenian school. And still we do have some ethnic mix in these schools. These are not only Georgian students or not only Armenian students in these schools. And what is also interesting and important is that we don't have some segregation by ethnicities inside these schools. Although there are that many students that actually possibly they could have segregated, but they don't. And if you look at the statistics for the classes, again, we can see that we almost don't have classes with more than 20% of ethnic minorities. And in Russia, we have 3 types of schools: schools with standard curriculum, gymnasiums, lyceums, and schools with advanced curriculum, which are in between. And mainly we find migrant students, ethnic minorities in the schools with standard curriculum. And this is a very illustrative map from St. Petersburg. You can see we have 3 schools located nearby, and in black you can see the share of minority students in these schools. And the school with a quarter of minorities is a standard curriculum school. Then we have the school with advanced curriculum and gymnasium. And also we mainly find minority students in the schools of smaller size. So the next question, do minority students get integrated in the school life? We don't know anything about their everyday life apart from the school, because our entry point to the data is always the school. And what we find out is that majorities in our schools are ethnically blind. They don't care whether this is ethnic minority or ethnic majority student. The probability to befriend the student is the same. While for minorities it is slightly different. They have slight probability to befriend migrants first, but they don't care about ethnic background. So it's like migrants tend to befriend migrants because they have shared experience of migration, but they don't care about ethnic background. And we also can see that ethnic minorities can experience problems at schools. Quite expectedly, these problems occur when they don't speak Russian or when they have problems with Russian. If you look at other subjects, they are not different from ethnic majority in our schools, and it's even more interesting for migrant children. When we control for ethnic background, we find out that migrants, which are all the colors besides the blue, migrants outperform non-migrant local students in our schools. And here we can see that if you are an ethnic minority student and you came after 7 years old, so you got enrolled in the school probably without knowing the language, you have high probability to underachieve at our schools. But in general, migrants outperform locals. And we also can tell you quite a long story about teachers and their relationships with the students. In general, teachers like migrant students, and they like interacting with the parents of the migrant students because migrants are obedient, parents want to get enrolled in the school life, and this is different in these schools because these are small schools, often with a lot of poor parents who don't participate in the school life. So migrant parents appear to be more active, more interested, more involved, and teachers like them. And this is the last part of my story. I will try to explain why do migrant children outperform locals in our schools, because it is a pretty interesting question. So here we differentiate between 2 migration generations. 1.5 generation, these are kids who came after 7 years old, and 175 generation, these are the kids which were born in another place, but came to St. Petersburg or to Moscow before they were 7 years old, before they got enrolled at school. So we can see that in general, migrants are more deprived than locals. Of course, they have less books at home, they more often don't have computer, they might not have the separate table to study, and much more often they live in rented apartments. But at the same time, migrants are significantly more motivated to study. They agree that study is important for their lives, that higher education is an important thing, and they disagree with the point that school is just a waste of time. And here is maybe the most difficult part of this, a bit of statistics. How do we measure the outperformance of the migrant students. We introduced the idea of resilience, so we find the group of students in the blue who study better than expected when controlled for their socioeconomic status. So we take the group of the same socioeconomic status, we calculate what should be their market school, and if they are better than that, we suppose that they are resilient. And here we can see that migrants are really much more resilient than the locals. So migrants have much higher chances to get better grades than expected for their socioeconomic background. And here comes the model which is supposed to explain this resilience, this overachievement of migrant schools. Actually, this is a simple causal diagram. If you see the arrow, it shows the influence of one factor on the other. So we can see that migrants are more deprived, and also migrants have higher chances to live in rented apartments. And then here it is a tricky relationship which shows that if you live in a rented apartment, you probably have higher motivation to study, which shouldn't be considered to be a causal link. Actually, we suppose it means that, yeah, we know from previous plots that migrants more often live in these rented apartments, and if you're a migrant, you rent your apartment, you are highly motivated. And this high motivation leads to resilience. And you also can see that the deprivation that they experience, it decreases the motivation of students, and but this decrease, this effect is weaker than the effect of rented. And now, if you look at the students who came before they were 7 years old, we see that these migrants are not deprived as compared to the locals, and actually there is no difference in their motivation with the locals, but these migrants are more resilient than the others. So there is a direct relationship between the migrant status and the resilience. To sum up, we find out that migrants of the generation 1.5, the migrants who came after they were 7 years old, have higher deprivation. They have less socioeconomic resources, but at the same time they have higher motivation, which explains their high chances for achievement. And migrants of the 175 generation who came as they were kids to Russia, they do not experience deprivation. They have the same motivation level as the locals, but still they have higher chances to overachieve. They have higher chances to get good marks at schools. And we explain it with the effect of immigrant optimism, which tells you that immigrants who come to the country or to the other region, maybe in our case, they experience higher optimism. So they have the sense that in the new place, they will get better chances for the better lives. So for the adults, this is the optimism concerning their jobs, and for the kids, it usually is about their studying chances. So they suppose that they will get better marks than the others. And we also have another explanation, which we call status maintenance, because if the students, if their families move to a new place, they lose a huge part of their social relationships. And they have to build new social networks, and they have to get a new status in this community. And this is why parents will teach their children that education is one of the easiest ways to achieve a higher social status in our community, in our society in general. And this is why these families will expect a lot from educational institution. And that's why students will try to study as hard as possible, even though they are not deprived, but they really try to get better marks. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ksenia, for the presentation. A couple of questions for clarification.
One short question. What happened to the second generation on those slides you showed, like, in the end of the presentation? Because there were like 1.5, 1.75, and locals. So what's the reason why you don't have them?
It is that we don't have them in the data. Because the second generation means that their parents came here and then they got born. And we kind of disentangle them from the locals in our research. Yeah.
Thank you. This is very interesting. But I've got the feeling you have focused on children of compatriot families. What about those who do not fall into that category, like Afghan children who've been in the country for several generations?
Our issue or problem here is that for the most ethnic groups, we don't have a lot of these children in our schools, so quantitatively we just kind of disentangle them from the others. And they get in this group of other ethnicities, as you told us yesterday. Yeah, this is our problem. No, I think that we don't have much of them, maybe in the regions that we study, so maybe they spread across different schools. And that's why we don't get a lot of them in our data. I don't know, actually.
Thank you. If you don't have any other questions for clarification, then I would give the floor to Evgeny with the first presentation on...
Добрый день. Разрешите всех поприветствовать. Спасибо за приглашение. Президент Международного фонда содействия и продвижения новых технологий в социальной и культурной сфере. Государство Алания. Организация зарегистрирована в Москве, живу в Москве. Сама являюсь дважды мигрантом. Вынужденный переселенец из Абхазии, нынешний мигрант из Грузии. После войны была там замужем. Скажите, пожалуйста, что мешает российской миграционной политике, какой бы мигрант откуда ни заехал или вынужденный переселенец, чтобы принять его, как пишется в Международной декларации по правам человека, обеспечив этого человека прожиточным минимумом? Я знаю такие случаи, где внук прописывается у бабушки только одна пенсия. Гражданство принимает человек, все, ты не мигрант, ты не вынужденный переселенец. Что за безумие? У нас нет никакой миграционной политики, абсолютно. Закон об адаптации мигрантов, абсолютно. А то, что касается садиков и школ, Царство Небесное, я встану. Бывшие... Хорошо, короткий вопрос, пожалуйста, пересмотрите то, что касается... Меня знаете, что не устроило, когда вы сказали, это хорошо, что мигранты в школах, то, что они на квартирах живут, у них стремленность к жизни проявляется еще сильнее, это тоже неправильно. Любой мигрант должен обеспечиваться всеми условиями жизни, права надо защищать. Давайте научимся в этой стране.
Спасибо большое. Сейчас переходим к третьему докладу. We are coming to the third presentation, yeah. Evgeny Varshever about grown-up children of migrants in Russia.
Yeah, thank you very much. So actually this project is in a way, I'll be sitting because I think that most important for the slides to be seen because all information is on them, and I'll be just the kind of patch to that presentation. So this presentation and this general project is kind of continuation of the project which Ksenia was speaking about, because 10 years ago I was participating in that project, doing some focus groups and interviews with school children and with their parents. And after time passed, the question arose, what happens to those children, Alexandrov and Ksenia Tenyasheva, and that huge and very good research team which was doing research in St. Petersburg and in other places in Russia. What happened to those children they were researching upon after they either graduated from schools or left the schools? Because passing a little bit forward, we know that not all of them graduated, and some of them drop out in an early age. So formalizing that a little bit, the research question can be what happened to the first wave of second generation migrants in Russia after they left school? What are their integration patterns? So you were talking about the first wave of second generation. I should speak a little bit about the context of migration to Russia. So first of all, we have to understand, that's very important, and that's the thing that would explain a lot of things related to migration in Russia, that international migration to Russia and in Russia happened only after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Before that, we had like a multiplicity of patterns of internal migration. Also, we had kind of a limited number of international migrants, including, for instance, Spanish refugees of 30s or Atkazniki trying to get out from Soviet Union. But mostly that's it. And when we're talking about international migration, it began with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we may divide the international migration on three parts. First, when we're talking about 80s, 90s, it's the return migration of Russians and ethnic migration of mostly Transcaucasians coming to Russian cities. 2000s, mostly as refugees and political migrants, and also economical migrants coming from the collapse in those places. So the 2000s is the labor migration coming from Central Asia. That's the new wave that was not present in 90s. And the third wave is the 2010s. It's the Central Asian migration, Transcaucasian migration, but also refugees coming from Ukraine. So when we are talking about migrants in this research, we're concentrating on, so to say, ethnic migrants, the ones that are perceived by the receiving societies as others. Some of them, most of them are visible migrants, if to build bridge to what Ksenia was talking about. And we're concentrating on ethnic second generation coming from Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Central Asian countries such as Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. According to our estimations, they form around 7% of all youth of the age 18-30. So we concentrate on this group. Moreover, when we're talking about second generation migrants, or from this moment I'll be referring to them as SGMs, they are all those who were born in a family of a migrant and finished the school or were socialized in Russia. So it's a broad definition, and we include to the category of SGMs also 1.5 generation and 1.75 generation as well. So basically, when we're talking about parents of those second generation migrants whom we're talking about, these are either political and economic immigrants of 90s or the labor migrants of 2000s, especially from Central Asia. So a little bit about the theoretical framework. It's the, how we call it here in Russia, it's the German tradition coming from Hartmut Esser and Friedrich Heckmann. So they distinguish between four realms or areas of integration. When they talk about structural integration, they talk about education and labor market. Cultural integration is attitudes and language acquisition. Social integration refers to social ties, friendships, and marriages, and probably also romantic relations. And the last area is the identificational integration, meaning the emotional attachment to ethnic and national categories. So coming up to the research design, we used it was the huge research project that was lasting for 2 years. It was done within the mixed methodology and combined all Russian online survey with qualitative research in 10 regions of Russia and digital ethnography. Digital ethnography is when we're researching like groups on the web, on social network sites, or we follow the profiles of our informants. So about this survey, the technology was the following. We were uploading the questionnaire on a special website called SurveyMonkey, and then we're advertising that survey to different groups of youth, including second-generation migrants, but also locals. We were doing that by two means. First, we were addressing all youth, and by that, it's not random sample, and we were communicating with the male group, which was targeting that youth. And also the other mean was that we were selecting the groups that are frequented by the second generation on the web, on the social networking sites, and we were targeting those groups. So in the end of the day, I can say that collaboration with Mail.ru Group, which owns the Russian social networking sites, was extremely successful. So we don't really know the algorithms which were used in order to approach those who were approached. So we cannot say that the sample is random. We have no competence to do that. However, in the end of the day, so it's non-random. It's not representative, but a good news is that it covers all Russia, and also the number of respondents is around 12,000 people, among which about 5,500 are migrants, second-generation migrants, and 6.5 are locals. And it more or less covers all Russian regions. Moreover, we are able to compare those groups because we believe that the biases of the sample regarding the second-generation migrants and regarding the locals are kind of the same. So we're not talking about absolute numbers, but we're talking about differences. And we're more or less sure about those differences that will be shown further. So if to speak about the qualitative part, it were 10 regions of Russia. It were in-depth interviews and observation, and not only interviews of second-generation migrants, but also their parents, experts including school teachers, school administration, ethnic organizations, and so on. And the way to achieve those informants were like absolutely different and various, including traditional, using social networking sites, using our acquaintances in those regions, but also we're using, for instance, dating websites. So a funny story was that Anna went to Tinder when we were in Krasnodar, and arranged a kind of dating / interview with a guy. Huh? Okay. But in the end of the day, I was the one to go there and to interview that guy, and I'm not sure that he was like extremely happy about that switch. Another way, we used the hashtag Armenian marriage in Sochi. So on Instagram, so we uploaded it, checked where the Armenian marriage takes place, and went to that place and interviewed people and made observations. So the variety of means, and it was all used in order to somehow combine data, because we're not 100% sure about the quantitative part, so we somehow do mixed method and triangulate that data to make some conclusions about how it works generally in Russia, because our ambition is to describe the fates of the second generation in Russia in general. So coming up to the results. In terms of, first we begin with the structural integration, meaning education and labor market achievements. So first of all, there are differences between two main groups of second generation as compared with each other and as compared with locals, meaning that Transcaucasian second-generation migrants are much better educated as compared with other groups. They acquire the higher education in more than 50% of cases. There is a huge contrast as compared with the other second-generation migrant group, namely coming from the Central Asia, because such share in their case is only 23%. So the locals are kind of in between, with the same figure being 36% of cases of people acquiring higher education or PhD. So this conclusion is generally supported, this picture is generally supported by the qualitative data, because in Moscow we're trying to find a person, an Armenian person, second generation Armenian, without higher education, and we did not succeed. We had to go out from Moscow to a market in Lyubertsy in order to find that person. And the other way around, there were several stories of Central Asian migrants that were dropping out from school, even in Moscow. For instance, there was a story about a girl who came here in a family of mother, father, and sister. So the father left, and mother was working hard, and she had to sit with her small sister because she was not going to kindergarten, because it's very difficult for migrants to enter kindergarten in Russia, and that's one of the peculiarities of our overall system. So in the end of the day, and mother was not very happy that her daughter walks in the streets and socializes with locals. So in the end of the day, they decided that she sits at home with her sister and doesn't attend school. So that's what happened. Now she works in a kind of barber shop. So in terms of monthly income, we don't have quality data because it's very difficult to measure that qualitatively. But in terms of quantity, we see no differences in rough estimation between the groups. But probably that absence of difference is due to some differences in, for instance, age or gender. So what we did estimations of regression and tried to include those factors and control for it. So after control, when we compare the groups, all second-generation migrants and locals, we see no difference. When we compare locals to SGMs coming from Transcaucasia and from Central Asia, we see that there is no difference between Transcaucasian SGMs and locals, but there is a difference between locals and Central Asian SGMs who earn 5,000 rubles less. So other special niches in labor market that are frequented by second-generation migrants, or probably there are some places or jobs they're reluctant to take, the answer is yes. First of all, they don't want to work in factories, and they don't do that. So, secondly, the Central Asian SGMs are highly more represented in catering and restaurants. Moreover, we see the figure of 25% if we count a little bit different and distinguish between different ethnic groups. We see that, or national groups. So we see that, we will see that the same figure for Kyrgyz migrants, and especially for girls, is 37%. So 37% of Kyrgyz migrant girls of second generation work in catering. There is a good explanation for that, because a huge group of first generation, both of their parents, but also of young first generation coming from Kyrgyzstan, they work in catering, and once you want to acquire a job, you're asking questions, people whom you know, and in the end of the day, you end up in catering or restaurants. So Central Asians also don't like to work in education, and they don't do that. In terms of Transcaucasian SGMs, they're more represented in healthcare, and that's due to Azerbaijanis women, but also in retails and wholesale trade, and that's due to both Armenian and Azerbaijanis men. Now we pass forward to the social integration. So we were asking questions about ties, about friendships, about people with whom they socialize in different realms, at school, on the workplace. So the general conclusion is the following. In most of those EGA networks, social circles, co-ethnics are present, but on the other hand, not exclusively, and most of those circles of communication consist both of co-ethnics and non-co-ethnics. There are no, so to say, closed ethnic cliques of second-generation migrants, or at least they are rare. Moreover, taking data from our qualitative part, we know that most those criminal gangs we know about, for instance, in Krasnodar, were polyethnic. I remember the interview in Krasnodarsky Krai, in a small town. The guy was saying he was a gangster when he was like 18, and then he changed his life, and now he's kind of Christian, strict one. So, and also he writes poems. And one of the poems, rap poems, one of his rap describes the polyethnic circle with whom he was like doing bad things in his like childhood and adolescent age. So it was Russians, Armenians, and Gypsies. So that was the beginning of this poem. What happened to them, I don't remember, but it was beginning with like citing and naming those ethnic categories with whom he was doing that. So, whom do SGMs date and marry? Still co-ethnics. However, there is kind of swifted and alternative pattern in case of SGMs coming from Transcaucasia and from Central Asia. So you see that in Central Asian case, males choose spouses of same ethnicity more often as compared with females, but in Transcaucasian case, it's the other way around. So the explanation is that we're talking about kind of ethnic hierarchies, and Transcaucasian men are more popular among local women as compared with Central Asian men. So Central Asian men try to retain this ethnic exclusiveness in choosing the partner. A little bit different picture is related to the romantic partners. Men usually socialize before marriage with women of other ethnic groups. Women are not allowed to do that according to the Namus culture and the honor culture, which is described by ethnographers, which those migrants are coming from. The next area is the cultural integration, and we're asking a question whether there is a value gap between second-generation migrants and locals. Actually, we should distinguish between different groups of locals, and very roughly we distinguished between between Russian locals and non-Russian locals. So the general conclusion is the following, that second-generation migrants, notwithstanding Central Asian ones or Transcaucasian, they are a little bit more conservative as local Russians, but there is no difference as compared with local non-Russians. Moreover, there is a intergenerational change in values. So we did the following equation. We evaluated the values according to the respondents of their families, of their parents, and their actual values, and tried to evaluate the gap between those two value sets. and distinguish between like liberal steps and conservative steps, meaning that liberal steps is that you are, your position is more liberal towards gender question as compared with your parents, and conservative steps are the other way around. So the conclusion is that around up to 50% of second generation migrants do liberal steps. However, there are stories about conservative steps as well. And we know about the story of an Armenian girl that was telling her mother to behave normally because her décolleté was kind of deep. So, of course, there is a gender gap in terms of values, and women are more liberal as compared with men because that's the question of power. Still, the tendency is that the intergenerational change is underway. So what about identity? As I have very little time left, I'll just say that it's inclusive, and second generation migrants don't have any problem with both feeling that they belong to Russia and also being the members of their ethnic categories. And so this position is characteristic for up to 70% of second generation migrants in Russia. So putting pieces together, I can say that second generation migrants in early adult age are well integrated, if you can use the word well after the segmented assimilation theory. Still, of course, there are problems. For instance, discrimination at school or gender questions. Still, that bunch of problems does not influence the general picture. And the general picture is that Russia is one of the best country cases in terms of integration of second generation in the world, probably similar to Australian one. So still, why it happened? One may think that it's due to some specific governmental policy towards integration of first and second generation migrants. Not at all. There are three reasons. First, the patterns of the migration of first generation of their parents were more resembling the internal migration because the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and people that were coming to Russia, technically being international migrants, were institutionally competent and were proficient in Russian and had no problems with understanding what's going on. The second reason is the cultural project called the Soviet Union, which was positively discriminating minorities and creating a situation when, in the end of the day, non-Russians had almost equal levels of education as compared with non-Russians. And the third, probably the most important reason, is the urban structures of Russian cities, which follow the pattern of the socialist city, meaning that we don't have ethnic neighborhoods as the norm, and as a result, we don't have mono-ethnic or migrant schools. So children socialize and in kind of mixed situations and mixed cliques and gangs and social circles. And in the end of the day, they resemble their counterparts that are non-migrants more than, I think, migrants or people that are coming from or first generation or people that are left in descendant countries of their age. So that's the picture that describes the fates of the second generation that were described by Ksenia and who graduated mostly from schools and entered the labor market. But now there are a lot of migrants at schools. their parents are of absolutely, not absolutely, but kind of different. They were migrating in different situations, and their social, economic, and cultural characteristics are kind of different. And the question, what happens to that second wave of second generation, is a big research question that we're able to answer after several years when they enter the adult life. By this time, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I might be biased, but these were interesting results. And so now we have options of 1 or 2 clarification questions to Evgeny before we proceed to Jens. So are there any? Yeah.
It's a very quick question. Is your target group perceived as migrant? What is the perception, about this group? Because the result you described is, I even wonder why you call them second generation. So my question is about the perception.
So I think that there is an intergroup difference, as when we were approaching for the qualitative interviews Armenians and Azerbaijanis, they were surprised that we called them migrants even of second generation. When we were speaking with and talking to Central Asian ones, it was clear for them that they are perceived as migrants, so I think that there is a kind of intergroup difference.
I had a clarification question about the school results of the Central Asian second generation. And 43%, if I remember correctly, only had an 8th, 9th, or 10th grade diploma. So they have a high school diploma or not even that. That's a large number. That would not be considered a big success normally. So, I mean, is this group, what explains this situation? And what, if you only have this 8th or 9th grades, what are your chances on the labor market? And that explains maybe quite a lot of what you see in the results of income and the sector they are working.
So we included 8th grade because, like previously in the Soviet Union, it was the general education diploma. Now it's the 9th grade. So most of those who are lowly educated, they finishing the general education. And then about the chances, I think that the most common story for, for instance, Kyrgyz migrants is that they acquire the general education diploma and go to work as a waiter or such kind of, I don't know, blue-collar jobs. In terms of the reasons, it's interesting question because we're asking people in our survey and also in our qualitative interviews about how they were socialized and brought up in families and what were their parents telling them, like whether you have to study. Everybody was telling that they should study. But there was a couple of cases when harsh Armenian fathers were saying that I don't care what grades you get, the most important that you're able to be brutal and fight back if there is kind of situation. Still everybody was saying that they were brought up in a way that they should study. But the variance probably explained by the example, because if in family people, the first generation, the parents are kind of educated and then they read books and they do some intellectual stuff, it works in a way that school children, their children are trying to emulate that behavior because as far as I understand, human being is more about emulation of behavior than about rational getting patterns. Yes, yes, yes. they have some ways to enter higher education, for instance, through the college system, because you're able to finish the general education, then you acquire a diploma, then go into tertiary education and how you call that, vocational schools, and through those vocational schools that are connected to universities, you're able to enter university without passing that exam which everybody has to pass in order to. So now situation changed probably a couple of years ago. So still the question is that probably that's the example in families, but still it's very interesting to figure out what's the reason, because every parent wants his child to be educated, and why there is a variance.
My question is also very much related to that, because in the whatever you had shown, that the Central Asians have a very different kind of a profile. And what explains that? That is, I mean, what explains, I mean, there are in all those figures that the Central Asians, in a way, they behaved a little bit differently than the Transcaucasians, and then with the locals. So what explains that? Because we see lots of kinds of snapshots of what is the situation, but the explanatory logic behind that I'm curious about. And one other question is that maybe, I mean, you might not know about that, but is there a study comparing the Central Asians in the labor market before the collapse of Soviet Union and now? That in terms of it would be very interesting to see, because of those sectors, that it might be the parents might have those restaurants, but also Georgian restaurants are all around, but they are not in that catering business. So what kind of a sector without documents, how you could get in. So it would be interesting to know about.
So for me as well, because it's the whole story behind that related to the Soviet Union project and differences within Soviet Union, and the whole story should be told beginning in the beginning of 20th century, and that would be a cool story, but we could not do that because the right word used was the snapshot. Our idea was to first and foremost describe the current situation, and then of course finding explanations, which is important, and that's the subject matter of strict regression analysis, for instance, which was not done so far because it was a huge job to do what we did. Still, I think that there are two reasons, and my hypothesis to that regression analysis is the following. First of all, social economic status of those parents, because I think that, and according to our qualitative data, there is a good reason to think that way, that Transcaucasian parents are more often businessmen and simply more rich as compared with Central Asian parents. And the second reason is the time of coming of those families, because once a first generation migrant comes, it takes some time to get to a certain level, and I think that the Central Asian wave is a little, not little, but seriously more late one. So I would combine.
Excuse me, I'm afraid that my English is not better, and may I ask to Russian? В начале вашего доклада вы сказали, что есть немецкая модель миграции. И я хотела бы уточнить у вас, как вы связали свое исследование и почему вы о ней упомянули в начале вашего доклада. Интеграция, да.
Yes, we're talking about the integration model, and that's not about Germany. That's about the general approach used because, for instance, some like international organizations use the distinction between like economic integration, social integration, political integration, and so on. But as the realms of integration are kind of intertwined, we thought that this distinction between those four areas is the most working one and the most convenient to rely upon when we're doing our research. So we're using this framework for, I think, 5 or 6 years so far, or even more. And so far, we didn't have any problems with them. But that's, I think, more technical, technical question and technical reason.
Скажите, пожалуйста, в результате вашего исследования, как вы видите выход из ситуации, чтобы снять ограничение приема в детские сады детей-мигрантов? Ведь это влияет на знание языка, на социально-экономический статус семьи, так как если родители вдвоем не работают при сегодняшней ситуации, естественно, дети будут развиваться иначе. А из-за незнания языка в школе потом они ниже учатся, потом в вузы не могут поступать. Как вы видите вот эту ситуацию, чтобы снять ограничения в любом городе России принятие детей-мигрантов в детские сады?
I, as a researcher, consider that to be an important problem. Still, I don't have an answer on that question because still I'm for that. I agree with you.
I would just add that it is not a limitation for migrant children often, but it is a long waiting list, and migrants are coming, and sometimes they come with children who are ready to go to the kindergarten, but people who are locals, they spend several hours in let us keep it to the discussion. Okay, if there are no other clarification questions, we will pass to Jens.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, we are already in the discussion, so I'll just take a little longer intervention, but actually we're in the mid of, and a lot of the things were already mentioned. So thank you very much. I must say what I was really impressed by the two Russian projects is the design, the project design, and the impressive numbers. So I think there's still a lot of interesting ways how to approach and how to get to the samples, which I really enjoyed a lot. What I found a bit confusing, but I think it is confusing in general, is this sort of ethnic minority. When is a minority an ethnic minority? So I found it interesting that in the end, I think you both opted for visibility as a criterion for one. But then I was surprised that in the end, the fact that they are visible is not shown up again in the analysis. So what is the role of stereotyping? What is the role of discrimination? I mean, when does it play out that you are visible as a minority? No, because normally, let's say, what we would say from, I think, from a definition of what second generation would say is it's because there has been a movement, let's say. So you grow up in a place where your parent didn't grow up. So the question is, do the parents have the social networks, the social capital, the cultural capital that you need to transmit sort of success or pathways to become successful to their children? And that, of course, is not necessarily dependent on whether you're visible as a minority or not. But maybe it's only for sampling issues. I don't know. No. And I would also briefly, I think we should reflect on terminology again. Let's say we try to avoid second-generation migrants because I think we believe it's a sort of contradiction. Either you're second generation or you're a migrant. And I think we should use terminologies also to inspire reflection. So maybe to confuse people, because we want them to think about categories and not just reproduce categories. It's also, and I think I'm concerned with this for two reasons. One is that we are tending to overemphasize a supposedly fundamental difference, because you say, so there are locals or there are some natives there, and then there are the others. But is the difference really so fundamental? No, and isn't it much more fine-grained, so that we should look more in detail what's actually, when do differences play out and not? And the other concern is more epistemological, more scientific, is aren't we a lot of tautological? So we start from a difference, and then we prove the difference. But have we ever had the chance to show if the difference is probably along another lines? Are we at all able to see that probably lines of differences are somewhere else, because we part from categories and then we reconfirm the categories afterwards? It's a very simple thing. Maybe it is in the end. It's a valid and of course it's a valid difference. But where is it really relevant? And I think you both stressed that SES was actually, socioeconomic status was actually the most important influence factor. So that would cut across. So just to probably as an outstander to the Russian situation, I would say I felt a little bit confused there. I would like to have a little bit more clarity at what point. And as I said, when do stereotypes come in? Because this is completely out. The perception of certain groups by the whatever we call it, the receiving society or the white Russian majority, whatever it is, it doesn't show up, and I guess it must have an influence somewhere or not. So this is more general for all. Maybe to talk, just to mention short things. Ksenia, you said there was this ethnically blind friendship things among the ethnic majority, which also surprised me a lot. I think Evgeny's results contradicted it, because he said that there were some of the outcomes would say that actually their friendships are a lot more biased by the ethnic background. Or maybe I'm wrong with it, but there is at least, and this is something which is to both of you, there is a statistical effect, of course. If you're part of a majority group, and especially if the minority group is only about 10-15%, it's statistically, it's much more difficult as a majority person to encounter a minority person than the other way around. Of course, not because only 15%, let's say, of the people that are around you are minority. While if you're a minority person, it's much easier to encounter a majority person. So that, just to take account of this, because I was a little bit doubting about that. And then also as an outsider, probably you had rented apartment as a sort of proxy for something, for deprivation, and this is not self-explaining for us, I think. Why is renting an apartment a sign for a working proxy for deprivation? And what does deprivation actually mean? I mean, it's also a question, is it a lack of resources? Why is a rented apartment a lack of resources? I understand books, of course, a lack of that there are not many books at home. The educational level of the parents, for example, would be, I think, an easy lead to explain. And then again, socioeconomic status, as I said, is very relevant. But how does that work out in a post-socialist society as Russia? Why is socioeconomic status so important, and how does it play out? Is it mainly income? Is it mainly or wealth that you have accumulated? Or is it also a question of habitus, a question of socio-cultural, is it a question of social networks, that people only move within the same social class? And how do you find social class in a post-socialist country? This is interesting for me. Let's say for you it seems so that's self-evident, probably, I guess. But let's say if you want to communicate your results to maybe to other parts of Europe or the world, probably it's interesting to assess that. I would really like to. Because also a point that Evgeny's mentioned, that he said, because of the socialist city structure, there are no ethnic neighborhoods. I don't understand. So what makes a socialist city structure that makes ethnic neighborhoods impossible? It makes them impossible, or it's an explanation that they are not there yet, which would also be a difference, of course. Because yesterday you told us that actually most of the apartments are owned, and that's why, let's say, ethnic minorities or migrants have to move into sublet sort of apartments. For me, that would be a calling for creating ethnic neighborhoods in areas where you can do that. So that's the question. Is it not there yet, or is it impossible to happen? Very briefly, again, on categorizations, you use the integration categories according to Esser and Heckman. I'm not as critical as a lot of other people are, but the main point that I have about is I don't think that social integration and cultural integration can be measured. I simply don't believe in that. No, because like all the points that are taken, for example, okay, friendship, I don't know, do the number of friends of different ethnic backgrounds say something about social integration? And do you only look at friendships with non-immigrants, or what about friendships with other immigrant groups? Then doesn't that also depend on the kind of school you're in and the kind of neighborhood you're staying in, the kind of leisure time activities do you do? Now, if you go to a sports club and there are mostly kids from other ethnic groups, of course most of your friends will be of ethnic background, but still, isn't it more relevant to look then what kind of language do you speak with each other? What is the vernacular that you use? What are the kind of music that you listen to? What are the kind of and dating is another. Intermarriage is a very classical, I think, complete fallacy in integration research to use intermarriage as a proxy for social integration, because I think there are so many, we've seen so much research, and we see that so many, especially in second generation, in the end marry co-ethnic or marry, which also again you have to distinguish between, do they marry co-ethnic who are also second generation, or do they marry co-ethnics that come from the country of origin or the place of origin? It's a big difference, of course. And we see a lot, we see in the US research, we saw it also in TIES, that in the end second generation frequently marries indeed co-ethnic. But what does it mean? Does it mean that they're less socially integrated? Why would be a person that intermarries with someone with a non-immigrant would be less integrated? No. And then again, do you also look at intermarriage with other ethnic groups? Which normally we don't in integration research. So I think I'm very skeptical about it, and cultural integration is, I think language use is the only interesting point there, and all the others it's not really valid. No. Yeah, it's speculation, or what does it say? I mean, how many times do you have to go to a restaurant of your own ethnic group to be non-integrated or whatever? So I'm really very skeptical about it. If you work with that, I mean, you should be very explicit. What do you actually measure? No? And be, not just do it, but like be really skeptical and really critical about it. Okay. I would urge you, both of you, you have qualitative material. And you've used it a little bit, like more as illustration and sort of anecdotal. And I think it would be really, really great if you'd manage. I mean, it's a lot of work, I know, but if you would manage to use the qualitative material also for analytical purposes or for explaining your quantitative outcomes. I think there's still a lot of room, and I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really applauding your mixed method designs, but you should do something with the other part, which is of course much more laborious than just spooling quantitative data. Well, maybe very briefly, I shouldn't comment on Maurice because we did the project together, so I'm biased on that regard. I don't know, maybe we should mention that we started talking about interaction effects. So although we've said like institutional arrangements are so important and the context is so important, but this does not say that we want to say that family factors, personal factors do not play a role at all. The important thing is how do they interact. So how much room does, for example, the institutional arrangements give for family factors? And as Maurice was showing, let's say, if you send children only to half-day schools, if you send them very late to school and they start learning the vernacular, a lot of the load is passed on to the parents. So then, of course, if you have a good educational background in the families, that's not a problem. And if we look at the well-educated parents to our second-generation respondents, actually the difference to those without an immigrant background was not that big. It's almost negligible. So it's really also, again, it's the educational background of the parents that runs through, and it makes a lot of difference in Germany, and it doesn't make any difference in Sweden. So, and we also had this, by the way, with marriage. That's a point. I mean, if you send out most of the girls if you allow them to leave the educational system at the age of 15 or 16, like in Germany, so they're very young. So then they go back to their families. They might be in a traditional family, in a conservative traditional family, and then for them it's very hard to defend themselves against claims. You have to marry early, you have to do things like. Well, if in Sweden, let's say the girls stay in school until the age of 18, and then have the diploma to go on to university. So they go on to university. So when they're out there on the wedding market, they're 25, 26, 28. And then, of course, that's a completely different age to defend yourself against claims from your family to please marry someone. So you see differences in the marriage patterns between Sweden and Germany. But probably it's not about a question of social integration. It's a question of opportunities and educational opportunities, of lifestyle opportunities. So this sort of thick description, and I think we found it particularly productive to use this sort of interaction effect things to look at both sides. So I keep it at this. Sorry, I could speak endlessly about more aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jens. That is a great start for the discussion. I suggest we have some more questions from the audience, and then we will provide space for every presenter to respond.
One question is addressed to Morris, and one, maybe both of us, to Morris and to Jens as well. Morris, you described your own approach as an institutional arrangement, institutional context. I'm wondering how much is it different from very famous political opportunity structure approach. As far as I know, it is about institutions as well, isn't it? So, the second question is the following. There was a research conducted in Germany recently, last year, if I'm not mistaken, and the striking finding was that half of all German citizens or inhabitants, I'm not sure, adults, are not able to read and speak German properly. So they have some skills, but these skills are not enough, not sufficient to understand semantically loaded texts. Yeah? So, but the most striking about this finding is not this amount. The striking point is that half of this amount were not migrants. They are natives. They are so-called Germans without migration background. So I'm wondering if you have some explanation to this, or maybe Jens has, and if there are some relevant, some similar research conducted in other countries, like Netherlands, or I don't know. Thank you.
I have one additional question in terms of both that your stuff is covering whole Russia, and do you see, I mean, from the design, it is just in a way the whole structure is taken to be as if it were homogeneous within Russia. So do you make any differentiation? And because of also this is about cities, that the conference, and also Morris, that the opportunity structures that you were talking about were all national opportunity structures. And especially in Germany, education is very much Länder. And did you see any kind of, I mean, in terms of gymnasium and that kind of, you're delivered to the hands of the class teacher is, I think, constant all around Germany, as horrible as it is. But did you see any kind of variation in the opportunity structures that get reflected into the into your results?
Any other questions?
Добрый день. У меня вопрос, ну, наверное, к российским исследователям. Вот неоднократно за эту конференцию звучала мысль о том, что большие проблемы есть со статистическими данными по миграции, с официальными. В чем проблема? Вот я не вижу, почему вот ответственные лица, кто должен заниматься сбором этой информации, не предоставляют эту информацию. Ну, потому что любой мигрант проходит кучу всяких, я не знаю, регистрирующих процедур, он должен получить миграционную карту, регистрацию, он должен потом где-то там оформиться, он, ну, в общем, кучу заполняет бумажек. Почему это не аккумулируется? В чем проблема? Я не понимаю. Расскажите. Господин Энси, обращаюсь к вам, потому что несколько замечаний. Я обращаюсь к вам, потому что мне не понравилась критика в адрес Евгения. Он очень хорошо аккумулировал данные, и когда он касался именно связи разных национальностей, там дружество он не обозначил. Именно когда создаются семьи, вот Средняя Азия типа женится на своих, немножко вы не поняли, не обижайтесь. Он правильно все разложил по своим пунктам, как есть в быту. Второе, мигрантов на поколение надо делить. Почему? Потому что, к сожалению, в законе России 1149 пишется, раньше вынужденный переселенец должен был определиться в течение года, а сейчас в течение 5 лет. Но я знаю вынужденных переселенцев 91 года, которые до 19 года не определились еще, поэтому он правильно это тоже поделил. Это уместно в нашей стране, по поколениям их делить.
Спасибо. Еще какие-то вопросы? Ну, тогда, пользуясь своей позицией, я тоже задам вопросы. Первый, so I will ask questions using my position as a moderator. And the first question is to Franz and to Maurice. You mentioned different factors that interact in this multiplier effect. Would you say something about spatial segregation? Is it important in which neighborhood you live? I remember from the design, I might be wrong, but like you selected different neighborhoods in different European cities. So did you see any local effect? I also have a question to Ksenia. When you mentioned that teachers in Russian schools usually like the parents of migrants and migrant children as well, do you find it equally in all the regions? Because I did some interviews in Yekaterinburg, and there are a large presence of migrants from Tajikistan. And now in schools they have children of parents who were born who were supposed to go to the school in Tajikistan in the 1990s during the civil war in Tajikistan. And they didn't usually have a chance to do this. So it seems like the value of education in these families is lower than among migrants of previous generations, and it adds up to the transnational life, because when they have something happening in Tajikistan, they can go to Tajikistan taking the children with them, and that interrupts the school year. So do you see these differences? Yeah, actually, you said second generation migrants don't really like working in factories and in education. So is it about liking? Is it about choice? Yeah, thank you. So the first to answer maybe would be Maurice.
Well, there were a number of questions, but I think the general theme is what Jens indeed said, the interaction between institutional arrangements and family resources, but also segregation. We found an effect that children that, like in Germany, in the Netherlands, who do not go to preschool, so they enter elementary school, and if that elementary school has a higher concentration of immigrant children, there's an interaction effect between these two. So if you enter a school with a lot of immigrant children in Germany and the Netherlands, it has an effect on your school success, a negative effect. Well, in Sweden, this is less the case, because language was already there in preschool, taught in preschool. So it doesn't affect the language acquisition that much. So that's one of these interaction effects which is very important. I was thinking maybe I will answer we did find an effect between Berlin and the other city, Frankfurt, because the selection age in Berlin is later, at age 12. So we didn't find an effect on this. But generally, I'm just trying also to see to the other two presentations that we seem to be looking for both the success and the failure again in the individual and family characteristics. And I think part of the success of the Russian story is the comprehensive school system. And part of the failure is not able to provide for children who for Russian is the second language. And there's a discrepancy between the two studies in the sense that you say, okay, they're highly motivated, but then if they transition to university, they don't want to go there anymore. So it's either they're highly motivated or so there's something else going on there in this transition. And I guess it's socioeconomic or it's structural issues with exams or the quality of the high school that doesn't provide the right support to continue. So I really want to urge to move away from immediately to see, okay, then if we can't explain it, it's family or it's individual characteristics, look at these structural factors, look at the institutions, because that's also where you can change things. I mean, if the family rejects education, it's hard to change it, but if there are structural barriers to go to university in the system, you can change it. So it's also a strategic thing to do.
Thank you. First of all, I have to agree with your comment, and in our studies we try to work in the framework of analytical sociology and the idea of combining beliefs and opportunities of the individual and desires of the individual. Like, what do they want, what do they think of the opportunities, and what are the structural opportunities that exist in this society. And regarding this fact that migrant children want to go or study better and they are highly motivated but they don't get to the universities, in our data we don't have these children, but if we suppose that these are the same children that get to the data of Evgeny, then this is a classic picture for the USA, for example. Their migrants are highly motivated, but they don't get to the universities. So it is an important question, and I would expect that, yes, it's mainly because of socioeconomic status and the state examination, which is quite a difficult thing even for Russians. So this is a huge barrier for our students. Yeah, that's what I like in our results. And again, returning to the Jens comments about SES, including this comment, I think this is one of the most fascinating results of our studies, that yes, socioeconomic status beats migration, and there are many such results all over the world nowadays. Like, if you have resources, you don't have problems, because you can hire additional teachers, you can go to some courses, you can find a school which will admit your child, you can do whatever you want. And if you're native, ethnic majority, and you're extremely poor, then exactly you will be the person who doesn't speak German in Germany. And there is a very illustrative example from Italy, because from Italy, sorry, because in Italy it is an issue. Many Italians who are not who have quite a low SES, they don't speak Italian very well. It is well known. And yes, it is a story of poverty. It's not a story of ethnicity and not a story of migration. And so Jens asked me about visible minorities and whether this was a fruitful category for our studies. I think that we also were introducing it because it is related to the idea of stereotyping and that these children will be excluded from social networks because they look differently and so on. But it appears to be that it is more intertwined with the language, because for our case, these visible minorities are also minorities who don't speak Russian as their native language. And this is why they are different from ethnic majority. But we don't find other evidence that they are stereotyped and so on. But we have some stories about adults. Adults really do suffer if they are visible minorities, because they will be stopped in the streets by the police and whatever, but we don't find this evidence for the children in our data. And also about these friendships and ethnically blind friendships, this is not my part of research. My colleague is doing this research applying social network methods like P2 and ERGM, and what she finds is that the proportion of friends from ethnic majority is always proportional to the share of these ethnic majorities in the classroom for the majority students, and minorities tend to have a bit higher proportion of minorities among their children. So probably this is the answer. And yeah, it's a very interesting question about rented apartments, because when you asked, I realized that it is a very Russian story, so maybe it's not very understandable for the others. Because in Russia, yeah, most of people have their own apartment, or they try to have own apartment, and we don't have this thing like in Germany when you rent apartments for the entire life. No, it is very different. And because these apartments in the Soviet Union, they were given by the government, and then they were prioritized, how's it called? Privatized, thank you. Yes, they got privatized, and it is still very important for us to have our own apartment. And renting apartment means, first of all, spending a lot of money, because if you have your own apartment, you don't have to pay for living there, you only pay for water and whatever. And also this means a higher vulnerability. You never know when you're kicked out of this apartment. And for visible minorities, it is another problem, because in most of advertisements of rented apartments, you read for Slavic-looking people. And yeah, I believe yesterday somebody told the story that ethnic minorities and migrants in Russia, they pay more for renting the apartments than the local people, because it is just more difficult for them to find the apartments, especially if they have family. And this is also partly the answer to the question about why don't we have ethnic segregation in our cities. It is really a very Russian case. We own apartments, which makes it very difficult for us to move. So, yeah, we still have very low socioeconomic segregation in the cities. We can have very rich and very poor families in the same house in the city center, and in most of the cities. I know that there are some cities where they create ethnic enclaves, but I know just a couple such stories. It's just maybe a coincidence. But in terms of when we speak about Moscow or St. Petersburg, they don't have opportunity to find such clusters when they could live all together, which saves them in a sense, you know. And all of us, it saves us from the segregation, which means that we don't get schools full of co-ethnic minorities and so on. And yeah, maybe the last question I will answer about socioeconomic status and how does it work in our models and in the life. First of all, for our research, what is important is that the school choice in Russia depends on your socioeconomic status, because the difference between standard curriculum school and gymnasiums is not as drastic as in Germany. But it is still very important because students from gymnasia have higher chances to pass state examination. Yes, yes. So it is different, but we have the same outcome. And although the rules try to, we have quite liberal rules of school choice, like schools have to admit every child from the area. But if it is already full, then these persons have to go to the other school and so on. And you know how it works. This is just a standard educational market situation when slowly the differentiation, the segregation between schools happens. And it's more about socioeconomic status, it's not about ethnicity. If you come to the open doors day in a gymnasium, you are told like, you will have to buy all the books, you will have to pay to the English teacher from the first grade on, and you will also have to pay for that and that. If you agree, you are admitted. And if you don't have money, you just don't go to the school. And so it's again about socioeconomic segregation. And do you have 1 more minute? Yes? Okay. The teacher's story, which you asked about. We are now preparing a book, trying to summarize all our research and working on the chapter about teachers. So the story is much more complicated, of course, than what I could tell in the presentation. And it's not the story that in all the schools, teachers always love children of migration background and parents of these children. No, it's not true. There is just a tendency that in poor, small schools, these parents tend to be more active, and that's why teachers prefer them. And also what we found in our qualitative data is that teachers, it's not a story, again, of ethnically or of visible minorities. It's not about teachers looking at these children and stereotyping them by their appearance. It's more about whether they don't violate the norms of the school life. So teachers don't mind if these are visible minorities who follow the rules, who are very obedient, who try hard even though they can't say a word in Russian, but they look okay, they like fit the school life. But they really get worried when these children don't follow the rules. When their appearance is bad, like we have stories of gypsy students who don't look well, and that's why teachers get really worried about them and they don't like them at schools. But if the same student from such a family gets to another school maybe and his appearance is fine, the problem will disappear. So it's more about following the school rules than about stereotyping them because of their ethnicity.
Yeah, thank you very much for all your comments. I would just add another side of the coin about making up of these ethnic schools. I would say that there is another side, which is like this majority pupils and their parents making decisions about schools. And again, in Yekaterinburg, as in other cities of Russia, there are cases when there are more and more students with migrant background, with maybe bad Russian language level, get enrolled in the school, and then Russian parents prefer not to get enrolled, even though there is a close connection between being registered somewhere and being able to enroll in specific school. So they prefer to get some registration in some other neighborhood of the city and get a child somewhere there. Yeah. Like the white flight on the level of school.
So I really love this panel. It's one of the most interesting events I participated for years, I think. Thank you very much. So in terms of visibility and the experience of bullying, most of our informants say that they were facing with bullying due to their ethnic background, but the question is how they dealt with that. And there is a huge variance, beginning with the facts when that bullying caused fights, and those fights actually influenced all further life because the person felt herself excluded from society and from the school class, and she had to fight every day, and now she's kind of traumatized person. But alternative good example, it comes also from Yekaterinburg, with a girl of Uzbek background. As I asked her a question, so have you faced bullying at school? And she said, I'll I'll try to translate that myself into English, but first in Russian. Один пацанчик пытался что-то сделать, я к нему подошла, говорю, пацанчик, ты что-то попутал? So the idea is that, so a guy approached me and he tried to bully me and I answered, hey man, did you mix up things? Like, you're behaving not well. I cannot translate that properly still. Either way. So, but still I think that we have sufficient quantitative data because we're asking questions about whether they're facing bullying at schools. So we can apply regression analysis and controlling biased factors, figure out how the fact of bullying at schools influenced the educational attainment and other factors, other indicators of integration. So in terms of social, economical, and cultural status, so what happens in families? And what are the mechanisms, because I'm also coming from that school of analytical sociology, which Ksenia mentioned, because, yeah. So what are the mechanisms behind that? I would add to what Ksenia said, the subject matter of determination and of self-control. So some time ago, we launched a research related to how, like marshmallow test, and whether a person was controlled and somehow internalized that control. So in the end of the day, he could control himself. He could control himself by himself. So whether it influences life chances, and from scholarship we know that it does, and probably the families with higher social, economical, and cultural status, they create an opportunity for a person, they teach self-control. And that self-control in turn helps him study and achieve things on the labor market and in other spheres. Then in terms of distinction between different spheres of integration, actually we agree with Portes and Joe, and we work in the framework of segmented assimilation theory, and in this case we're not saying that those people who socialize with locals more, they're more integrated. We simply say that there is a realm of social integration, and within this realm we should keep our eye on social ties. We're not saying that something is better than something than some other things. So in the end of the day, according to the segmented assimilation theory, there are combinations of different figures in different realms. So in the end of the day, we know that people that in some cases which are make a ethnic closure in terms of social integration, they behave better and achieve more things on labor market, and that's, for instance, the Chinese case in the US, and I think that it's kind of characteristic for some second-generation migrants in Russia as well. Answering Maurice about the school structure and that we have to keep our eye on what happens at schools, I agree, but also I think that this discrepancy between second generation coming from Central Asia, from Transcaucasia, cannot be explained by school systems simply because there was one school system for all of them. And I think that culture matters in this case, and social economical status of their parents is kind of the same. Still, in the end of the day, the parents of Central Asian are poorer as compared with. So I mean, like, they're coming from same backgrounds, rural ones mostly, but then what happened to them in the receiving society was different. And I think it could play the role. Still, a good explanation of that should be found further. And thank you for the institutional approach you brought to the discussion. So, and in terms of socialist city and how it explains the chances on labor market and whether we don't have ethnic neighborhoods, actually, yes, we have very low level of spatial inequality. And that makes a situation when migrants stick to their working places. And the only way and the only chance that there are ethnic neighborhoods or quasi-ethnic neighborhoods in Russia is the chance when there is a huge workplace for migrants, for instance, a wholesale market, and the buildings around can be populated by mostly ethnic migrants. And that's the case what happens in several streets in Kotelniki, in a city next to Sadovod wholesale market in Moscow. Same things happen in Sortirovka in Yekaterinburg, and same happens in Krastets in Krasnoyarsk. So that's actually, now we have launched a huge project related to ethnic segregation and creation of ethnic neighborhoods in Russia. And the answer is that so far they are very rare, and that's the only pattern which I now describe. Still, also we should understand that there are not so many migrants in Russia as compared with those countries from which we know that ethnic neighborhoods get created. And one of the elements of our research project related to segregation and settlement is creating and launching a actor-based modeling which would model Moscow, first of all Moscow, and we should, and for instance, we can tell the model that instead of 10% of migrants living in Moscow, there will be like 20% or 30%, and what happens in that case? And that modeling can answer the question whether those post-socialist structures will still create a situation when we have no ethnic neighborhoods except for rare cases, or will follow the pattern of global cities with a bigger share of migrants, and the ethnic neighborhoods will appear in Moscow. So that's actually also a research question which we're trying to answer. So in terms of, so the lady who asked the question left, still I'll answer about discrepancies, regional discrepancies and regional differences. There are. And I think that the differences between integration of second generation migrants, for instance, the structural one, generally follow the pattern of higher education acquisition in different Russian regions. For instance, in Moscow, people acquire higher education more often as compared with Krasnodar, and migrants also follow that pattern. What also matters is how I call that the construction, local construction of ethnicity. For instance, in Krasnodar Krai, for a long, it's on the south of Russia. For centuries lived Armenians. So the new Armenian migration wave came to the localities where Armenians already lived. And that seriously influenced the integration process, but in a weird way, because they were acquiring liberal, so to say, very roughly speaking, liberal values faster as compared with those who were coming to the places where there were no old Armenian migrants. And the mechanism behind that, as far as I understand, is the following. You come, you see that Armenians behave differently as compared with you, and you understand that they are like your people, you trust them, and in the end of the day, you're able to change your behavior faster as compared with situation when those behave differently, whom you consider to be ethnic aliens. So, there was a question related to databases. Why don't we have good migration statistics? So my answer is that it's the question of power and the question of fighting between different subdivisions of the Russian state, because Federal Migration Bureau and now policemen are fighting with special forces and FSB, and they don't trust each other, and they don't want to give opportunities to use their data. Yes, they have. So it would be very cool for researchers to have a big, cool, complete data set. But due to, for instance, that institutional reasons, there is none, and we're having what we're having. I had probably more questions, but I forgot them. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this great panel. I think there is a lot to discuss more, but maybe we could continue after the presentation. And now we are right in time to finish our conference. Thank you very much.
I would ask our English-speaking participants to put on the headphones, and our Russian-speaking participants could relieve. Значит, у нас такая практика всегда была на этих конференциях, что мы подводили итоги. Мы собирались, и у нас была целая сессия, там минут на 30, на 40, мы подводили итоги. Но в этот раз у нас все как-то не так, и лучше, мне кажется, более, так сказать, релакс, да? У нас нет ни одного чиновника. Это как бы есть минус, что они нас вообще не слышат, хотя они все равно нас не слышат, даже если они здесь. Но сейчас как бы они просто не мешают, да? То есть мы можем более-менее вести какой-то содержательный разговор. Это наше большое преимущество, и опять же вот специфика сегодняшнего дня в том, что нам не надо этих итогов подводить. Я уверен, что это бессмысленно. Да? Я не могу взять на себя такую как бы ношу, да? Подвести итог того, что вы 2 дня слышали. Это просто было бы и нескромно, и возмутительно. Да? У всех, наверное, какие-то есть свои выводы. Так что только я хотел сказать слова благодарности нашим гостям за их, так сказать, терпение, что они все это высидели, выслушали, прокомментировали. И я надеюсь, что это было не бесполезно и для них. И я уверен, что это было полезно для нас. Спасибо, до следующих встреч. Раз, есть, да? Важнейшие слова благодарности нашим переводчикам. Пожалуйста, отдельные аплодисменты. И, пожалуйста, еще несколько слов от организаторов. Да. А кто у нас от организаторов? Вы, да?
Thank you very much. So we'll switch back in English. I haven't seen you, or all of you, so just to introduce myself, I'm the head of operation for the ICRC in Moscow. And so I follow some of the discussion, and I also discuss with my team. I think we won't pretend that we can wrap up the 2 days discussion. I think there is a few takeaway from us, for us at least, and we hope from us as well. So first, thank you very much for everybody who attended, who participated, who contributed. I think for us, one of the elements is that, like we said, like while there are different reasons why people are displaced or migrate or move, there are often, or there may be, similar situations they have to face afterwards and experiences. And from that, it's true that our focus as humanitarian organization, as ICRC, is looking at the protection of the people, that every human being, that wherever they are, whatever the situation, is entitled to protection. And that's something that is important and we try to work on. Another element is that we work on a situation where we look at the needs first. So we're a base need organization, and that's where we try to make a change. This definitely for some, and I think I heard it in the question also today, we'll pose question. I think one thing is that the complexity of the need we find, and then the complementarity of different organizations help, we think, to solve that. I think we see it within the Red Crescent movement, but it's not all, and I think the question that were posed earlier on the, which led to this question, how the nexus, I'm looking at you because you have the question, the nexus humanitarian development works and how it doesn't work or how it could work better is definitely something that we should work on, that we recognize, and not that we have found a solution, but I think that I heard earlier today someone speaking about bridging the gap between the situation and the realities of cities, and I like the sentence because it's what it is about. So I think maybe just to close on that, I think we really appreciate, for me it was interesting to see the wide spectrum of perspective, of experience, of insight. And while we have certain focus, what we heard, what you provided, this information will contribute to our thinking, hopefully, and we hope that ours will contribute to yours. And the idea is to be able to continue in, of course, next conferences, etc., but also for us on the ground, in the field, in thinking how we can do better, how we can improve for these populations. This is often not in a really easy situation. So thank you all, and looking forward to continue the conversation at different levels. Спасибо.